In 1993, American soldiers entered Mogadishu with one goal: to capture a warlord. What happened next changed U.S. foreign policy forever. The story began in a land torn apart by hunger and war. Somalia, a nation on the eastern edge of Africa, had once been full of hope, but by the early 1990s its government had collapsed. The streets were ruled not by laws but by guns. Rival clans fought for power, and their militias looted food supplies meant for the starving people. Millions were caught in between. Civilians who wanted only peace but found themselves trapped in chaos. The world watched Somalia with growing horror. Famine spread like a shadow. Thousands died each month. The United Nations decided to act, sending peacekeepers to protect food convoys and humanitarian workers. In 1992, the United States joined a mission called Operation Restore Hope. Their goal was simple: bring food and stability to a country dying from war and hunger. At first, it worked. American troops landed on the beaches of Mogadishu. Under the eyes of international cameras, they were greeted with hope. For a moment, it seemed peace was possible. Roads opened, aid reached the people, and markets began to function again. But behind the surface calm, power was shifting. Among the clan leaders who controlled the city, one man began to rise above the rest: a former general named Mohammed Farah Aidid. Aidid was clever, ambitious, and ruthless. He led the Haber Gitter clan, one of the most powerful groups in Mogadishu. While the United Nations tried to bring peace, Aidid saw their presence as a threat to his control. He built alliances with militia leaders, armed his fighters, and spread his influence across the capital. His men started attacking UN convoys, stealing supplies and ambushing soldiers. The peacekeeping mission that had begun with good intentions slowly turned into a battlefield. On June 5, 1993, Aidid's militia ambushed Pakistani peacekeepers who were inspecting a weapons depot. 24 of them were killed. It was a brutal attack and then a turning point. The United Nations declared Aidid a wanted man. The United States was asked to help capture him. That mission was codenamed Operation Gothic Serpent. The U.S. sent in some of their most elite soldiers, members of the Army's Delta Force, the 75th Ranger Regiment, and the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, known as the Night Stalkers. Together they formed a special unit called Task Force Ranger. These men had trained for years in hostage rescue, urban warfare, and counter-terrorism. They were the best of the best. Their orders were clear: capture Aidid or his top lieutenants and end his control over Mogadishu. In August 1993, Task Force Ranger arrived in Somalia. Their base was an old airfield on the outskirts of Mogadishu. From there they launched fast, surgical raids into the city. They used Black Hawk helicopters and small ground convoys. The goal was speed and precision: strike hard, grab the target, and get out before Aidid's militia could react. At first, the missions went smoothly. They captured several of Aidid's key men, gathering intelligence and disrupting his network. But each time they struck, Aidid's fighters adapted. They began to study American tactics, learning where the helicopters landed and how the soldiers moved through the streets. They placed roadblocks, prepared ambushes, and used rocket-propelled grenades, RPGs, to target the helicopters that flew low over the city. The tension grew with every operation. Life inside the task force base was a mix of routine and danger. The soldiers knew they were in hostile territory. Beyond the wire, every alley and rooftop could hide a gunman. Inside the camp, they prepared constantly, cleaning weapons, checking radios, reviewing maps, waiting for the next call. They could go from rest to battle in seconds. In Washington, few Americans paid attention to Somalia anymore. The early optimism had faded. Media coverage had declined. But on the ground, the situation was boiling. Aidid's militia was becoming more aggressive, and the city was a maze of hostility. The people of Mogadishu were caught in the middle. Some supported Aidid as a nationalist hero. Others feared him as a warlord who thrived on chaos. Then, on October 2, 1993, American intelligence intercepted a message. 2 of Aidid's top lieutenants would be meeting the next day in the Bakara market area, one of the most dangerous parts of the city. It was an opportunity too good to miss. The mission was approved. The plan seemed simple: go in fast, capture the targets, and return to base. For Task Force Ranger, it was supposed to be another routine operation. They had done this before, quick in and quick out. But Mogadishu had its own plans. The morning of October 3rd began like any other. The sun rose over a city scarred by war. Helicopters sat ready on the tarmac, their rotors silent. Soldiers loaded their weapons and checked their gear. The air was hot, thick with dust. The operation was set to begin in the afternoon. A quick raid expected to last less than an hour. At 3:42 p.m., the order came, go. The roar of helicopter blades filled the air as the Black Hawks lifted off the runway, followed by smaller MH-6 Little Bird helicopters. Below them, a ground convoy of Humvees and trucks moved toward the city. Inside the helicopters, the soldiers sat silently, focused, scanning the city below. From above, Mogadishu looked like a patchwork of concrete, tin roofs, and narrow streets. But inside those streets, danger waited. IDID's men were everywhere, armed, alert, and ready. The first wave of helicopters reached the target building in less than 5 minutes. Rangers fast roped down onto the streets, forming a security perimeter. Delta Force operators stormed the building, moving fast and methodically. Inside, they found the 2 men they were looking for, IDID's top lieutenants. The capture was quick, efficient, and without resistance. For a brief moment, everything seemed to go perfectly. But then, the streets began to fill with armed men. Word spread through Mogadishu that the Americans were in the city. Fighters grabbed their weapons and ran toward the battle zone. The sound of gunfire began to echo through the narrow alleys. The ground convoy, which was supposed to collect the prisoners and take everyone back to base, suddenly came under heavy fire. Bullets slammed into vehicles. RPGs streaked through the air. Somali gunmen used every corner, every window, every rooftop. The convoy tried to push through, but the roads were blocked with burning tires and wrecked cars. The drivers struggled to find a route out as chaos spread around them. Up above, the helicopters began taking hits. The pilots maneuvered hard to avoid the streams of gunfire rising from the city. Then at 4:20 p.m., tragedy struck. A Black Hawk helicopter, call sign Super 61, was hit by an RPG. The missile tore through the tail rotor. The aircraft spun out of control and crashed deep inside the city. The calm, precise mission instantly turned into a desperate rescue. Other helicopters hovered overhead, marking the crash site. Rangers and Delta operators on the ground moved toward the wreckage, but the streets were filled with enemy fire. The rescue teams were pinned down, trapped in alleys trying to reach their comrades. Then minutes later, another Black Hawk, Super 64, was hit. It too crashed several blocks away. 2 helicopters down, dozens of men isolated, surrounded, and under fire. In the command center, officers tried to coordinate a response. Reinforcements were sent. Convoys tried to reach the crash sites, but every street seemed blocked or ambushed. Night began to fall over Mogadishu, and the battle that was supposed to last 1 hour stretched on and on. Inside the city, soldiers fought to stay alive. They used whatever cover they could find on walls, corners, abandoned buildings. Every time they moved, gunfire erupted. Ammunition began to run low. Casualties mounted. Medics worked under fire to treat the wounded. The rescue teams were spread thin, each one cut off from the others by walls of enemy fighters. Overhead, the Black Hawks that still flew provided covering fire. The pilots risked everything, flying low to protect the men on the ground. Some of them hovered so close that their rotors kicked up clouds of dust and debris, creating a wall between the soldiers and the militia. By now, the entire city of Mogadishu seemed to be at war. Thousands of armed Somalis poured into the streets. They fought not as an organized army, but as waves of gunmen, using hit-and-run tactics, firing from alleys, doorways, and rooftops. At the American base, commanders realized the scale of the disaster. What had begun as a quick raid had turned into the largest U.S. urban battle since Vietnam. Reinforcements from the 10th Mountain Division were called in. Armored vehicles from the United Nations, Pakistani, and Malaysian forces were mobilized to help. As night fell, the rescue convoys moved slowly toward the crash sites. Every few meters, they came under fire. Soldiers fought from house to house, inching forward. Some of the wounded were pulled to safety. Others were still trapped near the wreckage. Communication lines were breaking down. Nobody knew exactly how many were alive or dead. The soldiers who had come to capture 2 men were now fighting to save each other. And the world outside had no idea what was happening. Back in the United States, the mission was still officially described as a routine operation. News of the battle would not reach the public until much later. But inside the dark streets of Mogadishu, the sound of gunfire echoed through the night. By midnight, Task Force Ranger had been fighting for nearly 9 hours. Exhausted, dehydrated, and running low on ammunition, they held their positions near the crash sites waiting for rescue. Some of the men were wounded but refused to leave their posts. They knew that if they fell back, the enemy would overrun them. Above the city, the helicopters continued to circle, their searchlights sweeping through the smoke. From the ground, the flicker of gunfire and explosions painted the night sky in flashes of orange and red. The air smelled of burning fuel and dust. As dawn approached, reinforcements finally began to reach the city. Armored vehicles from the UN and American troops pushed in from multiple directions, facing heavy resistance at every turn. For the soldiers trapped inside Mogadishu, help was on the way, but it was still hours from reaching them. The sun rose over a city in ruins. Bodies lay in the streets. Smoke rose from burning buildings, and scattered across Mogadishu were the men of Task Force Ranger, tired, wounded, and surrounded. They had come to capture a warlord. Instead, they were now fighting the biggest battle of their lives. As the first light of dawn broke over Mogadishu on October 4th, 1993, the battle still raged. The city was silent in some areas, yet in others, gunfire continued to echo through the narrow streets. Smoke hung in the air like a curtain. The soldiers who had survived the night were covered in dust, sweat, and blood. Their uniforms were torn, their ammunition low, and their faces hollow with exhaustion. They had been fighting for more than 12 hours. Many had not eaten or drunk water since the mission began. They had been surrounded, cut off, and under constant fire, yet they still held their positions. For them, retreat was not an option. Somewhere out there, 2 Black Hawk helicopters lay twisted and broken, their crews either dead, wounded, or fighting for their lives. Inside the city, the trapped soldiers dug in. They used broken walls for cover and turned every street corner into a defensive position. They moved carefully, inch by inch, as gunfire ripped through the air. Some tried to reach the crash sites. Others held their ground, protecting the wounded. Communication was difficult, but they still managed to coordinate with each other using hand signals and radio bursts between gunfights. Far away at the airfield, reinforcements were finally gathering. American commanders had requested help from the United Nations forces stationed in Somalia. Pakistani tanks, Malaysian armored personnel carriers, and additional troops from the 10th Mountain Division. They formed a large rescue convoy, one that would push deep into the city and extract the trapped Rangers and Delta Force operators. It would not be easy. The roads were blocked, the alleys were too narrow for armored vehicles, and AID's militia controlled most of the area. But time was running out. The longer they waited, the more dangerous it became for the men still fighting inside Mogadishu. As the sun climbed higher, the heat became unbearable. The soldiers on the ground were running out of water. The streets were filled with wreckage, burned-out cars, debris, and the bodies of both Somali fighters and American soldiers. Civilians moved cautiously through the chaos, trying to help their own wounded, while others watched from doorways and rooftops. For the trapped Americans, every minute felt like an hour. They could hear the distant sound of engines, the rescue convoy slowly making its way through the city. But between them and safety stood hundreds of armed men. The enemy fought with determination. Believing they were defending their land from foreign invaders, they attacked in waves, firing RPGs and machine guns from every direction. The rescue convoy moved carefully, street by street. Pakistani tanks led the way, using their heavy armor to break through barricades. Malaysian armored vehicles followed, carrying American and UN troops. The convoy was large, loud, and powerful, but also vulnerable. Every turn of the street could be an ambush. Meanwhile, the soldiers around the crash sites were holding on. They were tired beyond imagination, their bodies pushed to the limit. Some were wounded but refused to be evacuated until others were safe. The ground was littered with empty magazines, shell casings, and broken gear. They had fought all night, and yet the fighting continued as the sun climbed overhead. By late morning, the rescue convoy finally reached the first crash site. It had taken nearly 6 hours to travel just a few miles. The soldiers quickly loaded the wounded onto the armored vehicles. Every second mattered. The convoy then pushed toward the second crash site, the one where Super 64 had gone down. That site was still under heavy fire. 2 Delta Force snipers had volunteered to defend it through the night, knowing the odds were against them. When the rescue forces finally reached the area, They found the helicopter wreckage almost destroyed and the defenders gone. It was a grim reminder of how fierce the battle had been. As the convoy gathered the survivors, more soldiers joined from nearby positions. They climbed onto the armored vehicles, helping each other, pulling the wounded aboard. Many were too weak to stand. For the first time in almost a full day, they began to feel a small sense of relief. But the fight was not over yet. The journey back to base was another battle. The convoy was so large that it could barely move through Mogadishu's narrow streets. Militia fighters continued to attack from rooftops and alleyways. The sound of explosions and gunfire followed them all the way. Soldiers inside the vehicles returned fire through small openings, trying to keep the enemy at bay. The operation that was meant to last 1 hour had now stretched into 18. By the time the convoy finally reached the safety of the airfield, it was nearly mid-afternoon. The men climbed out of the vehicles slowly, limping, bleeding, carrying each other. Some collapsed as soon as they touched solid ground. Others sat silently, staring into space. The look in their eyes told the story. Exhaustion, shock, and disbelief. 18 American soldiers had been killed. More than 70 were wounded. Hundreds of Somali fighters and civilians had also died. The battlefield stretched across the heart of Mogadishu, leaving behind burned vehicles, shattered homes, and broken lives. News of the battle spread quickly around the world. Images of dead American soldiers being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu appeared on television screens. The reaction in the United States was one of horror and anger. Many Americans had not even known their soldiers were still in Somalia. Now they were asking why their sons had died in a place most had never heard of. In Washington, the government faced a storm of criticism. The mission had been meant to capture a single warlord, but it had turned into a disaster. The public demanded answers. Military leaders defended the bravery of the men who fought, but they also admitted that the operation had underestimated the enemy's strength and the danger of urban warfare. For the soldiers who had survived, the memories of that day would never fade. They had fought side by side in one of the most intense urban battles since Vietnam. Many were haunted by the friends they had lost and the civilians caught in the crossfire. Task Force Ranger left Somalia shortly afterward. Within months, the United States withdrew most of its troops from the country. The UN mission continued for a while, but eventually ended as well. Somalia returned to the same cycle of violence and instability that had existed before the intervention. In the years that followed, the lessons of Mogadishu were studied carefully. The battle showed how dangerous modern urban combat could be, where technology and training could be overwhelmed by chaos and close-quarter fighting. Commanders realized that even the most advanced soldiers could find themselves vulnerable in environments they did not fully understand. The events of October 3rd and 4, 1993, left a deep mark on U.S. foreign policy. For nearly a decade afterward, American leaders were reluctant to send ground troops into similar conflicts, especially in Africa. The fear of another Somalia incident shaped decisions in Rwanda, Bosnia, and later in the Middle East. But beyond politics and policy, the story of Operation Gothic Serpent remained one of courage and sacrifice. Every soldier who fought in Mogadishu that day showed extraordinary bravery. They fought not for fame or victory, but to protect one another, to bring their comrades home alive. In the years that followed, books and documentaries would tell their story. The most famous of them was Black Hawk Down, which introduced the world to what really happened in those streets. But for those who were there, it was not just a story. It was a memory carved into their minds forever. The sound of gunfire, the faces of friends, the long night that never seemed to end. For the people of Somalia, the battle was another chapter in their long struggle. The death and destruction left deep scars on the city. Many Somalis still remember the roar of the helicopters, the explosions, and the endless night of terror. The civilians who lived through it lost homes, family members, and any sense of safety. As time passed, some tried to find meaning in the tragedy. Others simply tried to forget. Yet even decades later, the story of Mogadishu still stands as a warning, a reminder of how quickly a mission of peace can turn into a nightmare of war. In military academies around the world, commanders still study the operation. They analyze the mistakes, the courage, and the chaos. They learn how communication broke down, how vehicles got lost in the maze of the city, and how small tactical errors became life-and-death struggles. The lessons of Mogadishu changed how future missions were planned, with better coordination, more armored protection, and clearer exit strategies. But no lesson could ever erase the pain of those who lived through it. The survivors carried the memory with them, of friends they could not save, of the long hours trapped under fire, and of the promise that no one would be left behind. Years later, when asked what kept them going, many said it was simple: loyalty. They fought because the man next to them was their brother. In those moments, under the gunfire and smoke, that was all that mattered. Today, the story of Operation Gothic Serpent is remembered not only as a military mission gone wrong, but as a symbol of bravery under impossible circumstances. It showed the world the cost of war, not in numbers or politics, but in human lives, in the courage of ordinary men placed in extraordinary situations. In the dusty streets of Mogadishu, under the burning sun of October 1993, they fought for each other. They fought surrounded, outnumbered, and far from home. They fought with everything they had, and even when hope seemed lost, they did not give up. That is what history remembers. Not the politics, not the headlines, but the soldiers who went into a city to capture a warlord and found themselves in one of the most brutal battles of modern times. Operation Gothic Serpent remains a defining moment, a mission born from good intentions that turned into tragedy, a lesson written in blood and courage. And though the war faded and the world moved on, the memory of those who fought in Mogadishu still echoes, in the silence that follows the gunfire, in the empty seats left behind, and in the eternal question that lingers after every battle: was it worth it?